Hi, it's Professor Moylan, and this micro lecture deals with podcasting. I think you should have a podcast for each course you're teaching in fall 2020. It's easy. Here's how to do it. First off, let's very, very quickly describe what it is in case you're not familiar with the concept of podcast. A podcast is a audio file that you create. So you use a simple program like Audacity and you record your audio file. Okay, now you've got your audio file. You upload it to your podcast host, and I'll talk about those in just a second. That's just one place. You take your one file, at a time, one at a time, and send it up to your podcast host. Now, your podcast host feeds it to all of these different platforms that your students might be listening to: iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Player FM, iHeart, SoundCloud, and on and on and on. You just upload it once to your host. Your host then pushes that feed out to all of those platforms. And then, of course, your students, glued to their phones, will then listen to your podcast from whichever of those places that they listen to music and podcasts. Okay, so in its essence, a podcast is a radio show. There are episodes. Listeners listen when they want. You upload each podcast one time to one place. Your students are told there is a new podcast if they've subscribed and you tell them to subscribe, and they listen on whatever platform they want. Okay, let's take those one at a time. Episodes. A podcast can be 5 minutes long, it can be an hour long, it can be 3 hours long. Although, of course, for our purposes, we're probably going to limit them to 5 to 15, maybe to 30 minutes, depending on what the situation is. Students listen when they want. The old-fashioned concept of a radio show, the show is on Saturday morning from 9 to noon. Well, no, your podcast is on whenever your students want to listen to it. You upload each podcast once to your podcast host. You have to pick a podcast host, and again, I'll talk about that in just a second. Your students are told when there are new episodes. They will subscribe to your podcast, and so then when a new podcast hits, they will be informed that there's a new podcast for them to listen to. And then they listen on whatever platform they want: iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, and on and on and on and on and on. Or they could just listen to it on their computer. But most of them have several listening platforms on their phones, of course. Okay, so basically that's the model of how it works. Okay, equipment. You don't need a fancy radio station setup. Here's my setup. Could not be simpler. Probably has 90% of the functional capability of that fancy radio broadcast booth. This does the job for me. In fact, sometimes I will just record it on my little Sony digital recorder, and you can see there, I've got a picture for scale there, this little teeny Sony digital recorder, which I carry with me all the time, and it's in my car, and a lot of times I will do a 10-minute, 15, 20-minute broadcast, if you will, while I'm driving in my car. Makes very, very efficient use of that time. I'll give you an example of that in just a second. Okay, now here's the thing. You do have to choose a podcast host, and while there are a couple that will give you a super basic one for free, you're probably going to spend between $5 and $15 a month. There's a whole bunch of them. So I'm going to let you just look for yourself. I'll tell you who I use, but these all basically work about the same. Buzzsprout, Libsyn, that's one that I use, Podbean, Blueberry, SoundCloud, Podomatic. I don't like that name, but I've heard good things about them. Simplecast, Captivate, Pandora, Anchor. There's just a whole bunch of them. Okay, now podcast host costs. The cost depends on the quantity of your content. Here's a good rule of thumb. 1 minute of audio equals 1 megabyte of file. That's actually a little bit high. It might be more like 0.8, but just to make the math simple, 1 minute equals 1 megabyte. Now, here are the Libsyn costs. You can see the things are all the same, other than the amount of content that you have, your monthly storage. So 50 megabytes for $5, that's 50 minutes. 250 megabytes, that's, more than 4 hours, $15, and so on. And I should point out, this is new content. So you start at the beginning of the semester. Let's say that you sign up August 15, and you, have 50 minutes worth in the first month. And then when the new month starts, you've got 0 minutes, because all that old stuff is archived. So this isn't the total amount, this is the new amount each month. So I think many people could easily do the $5 a month. And again, this is just Libsyn. Look at a bunch of different, possible podcast hosts. But, 50 minutes a month is, 15 minutes a week. I'll show you what I'm going to do with my podcast in just a second. 15 minutes a week. I might be bumping up on that. I think I'll go up to the $15 a month, where I get 250 megabytes. But we'll see about that. Tell your students the name of your podcast so that they can find it. Give it a real easy to remember name. Professor Moylan. That's the name of my podcast. Couldn't be simpler. Although I may change that if I'm going to have a separate podcast for a second course. I think I'll change this. Right now I've set my podcast up for my Principles of Marketing course. I may change that to PM Marketing Essentials, Professor Moylan's Marketing Essentials. And of course, I'm going to put the link to it up on my learning management system. But again, they can then find it on any music platform that they are using. But yeah, tell your students the name of your podcast and tell them to subscribe to it. Okay, so here's my Professor Moylan's podcast on Libsyn. If I want to add a new episode, I simply record it and then upload it right there, the little plus button, really, really simple. Here's a cool capability. If I know that, hey, I want this to be available to students Sunday night, whatever the date, I will put it up there whenever I want and then schedule it for release Sunday night, that date. So that's a really neat capability that you've got. Now, what will go into my podcast? A key thing is Sunday night, I'm going to give them what I'm going to call the Sunday night talking points, and that explains what's happening in the upcoming week. And I suspect that's probably going to be about 10 minutes. Here's the thing. My students are not going to read long memos from me, but they'll listen for 10 minutes. So I'm going to, every Sunday night, push out the Sunday night talking points that explains to them what's going on during the week. Then opportunistically, in the news. One of the great things about teaching business classes, especially marketing classes, is there's always something in the news that I can use to make the topic just absolutely come alive. And sure enough, today I am doing this on June 18. Yesterday, huge branding news. You probably saw it. The makers of Aunt Jemima are walking away from that brand name, which does not surprise me in the least. In fact, in my Principles of Marketing class 2 years ago, I said that I bet they've got a plan in place if conditions come about that they're accused of having a racist name, which with the internet, all you have to do is do a little bit of searching and you see some of the just absolutely horrific prior images that the Aunt Jemima brand used on their packaging. And of course, the name is just completely inappropriate, by today's sensibilities. So they announced yesterday that they are going away from that Aunt Jemima name. And in fact, I recorded my podcast driving into the office today. Let me go ahead and I'm just going to play it. I'm just going to play my podcast.
Students, good morning. It's Professor Moylan. Big marketing news today, big branding news. Aunt Jemima, which is a brand of the Quaker Oats Company, a unit of Pepsi.
Well, you get the idea. It's just so easy to create a podcast and then push it out to your students. When we get to that discussion on branding, I bet you Uncle Ben's will have already announced that they're changing their brand name. This one's going to be a lot easier than Aunt Jemima. They can just go to Ben's probably, Cream of Wheat, they don't even need to change the name of their brand, but they will lose that person on the top of the brand. Well, In the News is a perfect thing for my podcast. Pivot to Online podcast. Should I have a podcast for Pivot to Online? I'm not sure. Right now I don't have one, but I may. So if you are interested, go back to the Pivot to Online website. There's no podcast right now. I've prepared for the future. If I do come out with a podcast, there'll be a little link right up at the top for the podcast, but it's not there just now. But every course you've got probably would benefit from a podcast.